Well, that wasn't too bad, actually. I wonder what memories I'm suppressing. Ah, well, they're probably 50 Shades related. Hello, my beautiful watchers, and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation. I believe I was just about to give you my final thoughts on the Scott Pilgrim film adaptation as a whole. First of all, I want to say that all things considered, this is a valiant attempt at a Scott Pilgrim film adaptation, and I'm not just saying that because I enjoyed the film on its own Edgar Wright-related merits. They had every excuse they could have needed to justify doing completely their own thing with it, but they only did kind of their own thing with it. I am, however, clearly not saying that it's perfect. The main failing of this adaptation is its lack of character development. Both comic and film Scott start the story as lazy, amoral, self-absorbed wasters, perfectly content to lie to their significant others, sponge off their friends, and make zero effort to get a job or do anything with their lives. But only comic Scott eventually had to face the reality of what his treatment of his friends and lovers had done to them, and see what his life would have been like without the people he'd taken for granted for so long. Yes, they tried to cram a semblance of this into the last few minutes of the film, with Scott on his second attempt acknowledging his band, apologizing to Kim, and confessing his adultery to Ramona and Knives. The problem is, with the happy ending so close after that, it inescapably means Scott doesn't face any real lasting consequences for any of his foul deeds, so with human nature being the way it is, it's very unlikely he will have learned any permanent lessons from them. Comic Scott gets a job, Comic Scott has a chance to cheat again and turns it down, Comic Scott finds a way to establish a relationship with Knives without taking advantage of her emotionally, Comic Scott learns to confront his past misdeeds and accept them as part of who he is so he can become a better person, and Comic Scott admits that he isn't entitled to get Ramona back, he has to earn her back by doing better than he was before. He goes from, I have to get with this girl no matter what, to I have to be a better person for this girl, and finally to I just need to be a better person. The closest thing Film Scott has to a character arc is him overcoming his Michael Cera-ness and showing that he has some balls right at the end, and even that is undercut somewhat because he goes right back to being self-conscious and meek right afterwards. Film Ramona faces the same lack of character development issues as Scott. She never seems to make it past the generally disinterested, slightly rude woman she was right at the start of the story. I'm not even entirely convinced the film version of her even likes Scott, and well, okay, yeah, that's fair, why would you? He's a dick. This is another thing that I didn't take issue with until I read the comics. Seeing that Ramona was supposed to eventually warm up, form connections with the other members of the group, start showing Scott some genuine affection, be enthusiastic about things, and end up portraying a much more obvious vulnerability, made me realize what a non-character she was in the film beyond being an attractive, too-cool-to-care hipster chick. Kim, Stephen Stills, and Wallace, the arguably next most important characters, don't suffer for lack of development nearly as much, not because they got any, just because the film treated them very much as background characters, so you don't notice its absence as much. They were there to facilitate the main plot and make, or be, jokes, not to have any subplots of their own. I already touched upon this last time, but the transition between insane evil genius comic Gideon and slimy git film Gideon is kind of fascinating. The film version can certainly fit in the same role in the story, but it's almost like he's a parody of the character he was in the book as opposed to a film adaptation. You might have noticed we never got a definitive explanation of what exactly happened between Scott and Envy the night they broke up, but I don't think we really needed one in the end. It's pretty safe to say there was equal blame to go around, and they were hella not right for each other. Because Envy was written out at the finale, her story becomes not so much one of personal growth, but a straight-up revenge fantasy for anyone who's ever been left for someone else.
You just headbutted my boyfriend so hard he burst.
Yeah, how'd you like that, Emma? I mean, Envy. She's still a pretty good and surprisingly memorable character in the film, mostly due to Brie Larson's excellent performance, but I don't know, I think it would have been nice for her and Scott to have gotten their mutual closure. The next big difference between the comic and the film isn't a failing of adaptation as such, but an inevitable consequence of some of the decisions they made to make the story work better as a film. Namely, the big difference in what these two Scott Pilgrim stories were ultimately about. The Scott Pilgrim books are a coming-of-age story, but they're not just a coming-of-age story. I wouldn't have loved them so much if they were. There's a million and one straight-up coming-of-age stories to the point where I'm kind of sick of them. No, the Scott Pilgrim comics are also a cautionary tale about the consequences of not coming of age when it's time to do so, and highlights that it probably won't be you who ultimately pays for this failure, but those around you. This was an awesome premise for a story in my opinion, but it's one that takes time to tell, a long time. Even if we assume for a moment that O'Malley provided the film's writers with a detailed synopsis of everything that was going to happen in all the incomplete volumes, the story that the 6 Scott Pilgrim comic books is telling is just too long to fit into a film. From start to finish, it takes place over more than a year. Over a year of character development. That's incompatible with a single film storytelling format. From what I've been able to tell over the last few years, filmmakers have 2 adaptation options when faced with this problem, assuming their intention is not to simply throw the book out of the window. Do what each and every one of the Harry Potter films did, keep the timeline but only tell the bare bones of the story, incorporating countless time jumps and covering most but not all of the essential plot moments. Or change the story so it takes place over a much shorter amount of time and accept that that means you might not be able to keep some of its fundamental core messages. This particular film chose the latter option. I would like to make it clear that neither option is automatically superior, and both require you to omit much of what made the books good in the first place. A bigger factor in success is how skillfully the filmmakers carry out their choice, whichever one it is. By the way, I know I reference the Harry Potter films far too often in this show, but they're the reason I am the way I am in regards to film adaptations, so yeah, that's not going to stop. I can't. To fit a shorter timeline, the film adapters had to make Scott's journey less about growing up and confronting one's own inadequacies, and almost exclusively about if Scott would or would not win the day and live happily ever after with his love interest, with a secondary, much less pronounced emphasis on Scott finding his self-confidence. That this is comparatively shallow is a sacrifice the filmmakers had to make for the reasons I just described, so I won't hark on about that. What's more interesting to me is that for the most part they actually adapted the existing story to suit this pretty damn well. To start with, they subtly changed it so up until the moment he decides to fight Gideon at the end, Scott never willingly seeks out a battle with an ex like he so often did in the comic. They come to him and don't give him a choice, or he unknowingly stumbles into the situation. This way they could still include all the battles while maintaining the plot thread that Scott doesn't have the stones to do anything for himself. I have to admit Sarah's casting was perfect for this new character arc, as he sure as fuck doesn't radiate confidence and self-respect as standard. However, despite how impressed I am with how well they applied this method of adaptation overall, I have to admit that pursuing this new arc for Scott while also keeping so many line-for-line moments from the books does create a certain dissonance between Scott's new personality and his actions. You can see how overly self-confident, fist-happy comic Scott became the best fighter in the province and a serial womanizer, but this wallflower? It just doesn't add up. Scott's new film personality also lessens the impact of some of what were his greatest achievements in the comics. There's also nothing that really suggests that Scott is afraid of commitment in the film. He's damaged from his breakup, sure, but that actually seems to make him more willing to rush things, not less, so unless you assume him saying lesbians instead of love is a mental block he had to fight to overcome, gaining the love sword doesn't come off as a huge breakthrough for him. So too, the second time around, when it's treated as a big deal that he's fighting Gideon for himself, not Ramona, and gains the sword of self-respect, it's kind of odd because, well, Scott's done plenty of things for him since the start of the movie. You could even call him a selfish bastard who does everything with himself in mind. Even the big conclusion to his new arc of finding confidence lacks satisfaction. They did such a good job of making Gideon punchable, him running off to punch him at the end doesn't immediately seem like him overcoming an inadequacy, he's just doing the obvious thing. A fun fact about me, I am really bad at seeing symbolism. I tend to take things quite literally and at face value. Not out of an active choice to celebrate ignorance, I'm just really bad at seeing symbolism. That said, the significance of haircuts in this comic series is impossible to miss even for me. Because of the timing of his haircut to Envy dumping him, Scott fears change and associates haircuts with it. Him letting Ramona cut his hair in Volume 3 represented the moment when he started being willing to change for her, to strive to be a better person so he wouldn't end up hurting her like he does everyone else around him. Ramona, on the other hand, straight up explains at the end that she forces herself to change constantly so she won't get stuck in one place while the world changes around her, and therefore it was significant when she stopped changing her hair when she was happy in Volume 4, but cut it in 5 when she had her crisis and left Scott. I never really thought I'd ever be reading this much into haircuts, but here we are. The film kept Scott's traumatic association with them, but Ramona constantly changing her hair is implied to be just a cute quirk of her personality. Again, I do want to stress that I actually think they did a really good job of pushing this square peg through the round hole. It just wasn't seamless. O'Malley has gone on the record saying that he thinks the film's ending, that tied the conclusion to the Knives-Scott-Ramona triangle into the final confrontation with Gideon, was better than the slightly convoluted, glow-orientated ending he came up with for the comics. I guess I agree that it does make a more satisfying climax, though I wouldn't have wanted him to drag out the obsessive stalker part of poor Knives' emotional journey all the way through 6 books, so he could have done the same thing. However, Wright and the other filmmakers discovered that they had something to learn from the comics ending as well, because the ending we're all familiar with was not their first choice. Those of you who are avid watchers of my show will know I tend to ignore deleted scenes and alternate endings. Deleted is deleted. If it's not in the final product we saw in cinemas, why should they get extra points for it? However, in this case I'm choosing to make an exception, simply because the original, hastily changed ending to the Scott Pilgrim film is fucking fascinating in how horrifying it is. Like, emotionally horrifying. It doesn't become like a gore fest or anything. In the original conclusion to the film, Scott bids a bittersweet goodbye to Ramona as she goes to travel the world alone, and gets back together with the high schooler he used and abandoned at the drop of a hat. Yeah, Scott chose knives in the original cut of the film. And you know what the worst part about it is? The setup. In another deleted scene, Scott and Ramona's posthumous desert conversation goes a little differently.
I really fought for you back there. Someone was fighting pretty hard for you too. Knives? Wish I was never as fanatically devoted to anything as that girl is to you.
This not only conflates being an obsessive stalker with true love, it's also a line from the comic. A line that was originally delivered mockingly by Ramona to Knives herself as she sat crying on the floor of a public bathroom and was about to reveal that Scott cheated on both of them. The original context of this line made it very, very clear that it was not a good thing to be this devoted to someone who hurt you, and they still used it to try to justify Scott choosing to get back together with her at the end. With all that in mind, I have to ask, Edgar Wright, buddy, are you okay? I'm asking out of concern as a huge fan. Moving on from that, I really wish I could have seen the film that Edgar Wright might have made if he'd had access to all of the finished books. Not because I didn't like this film, but just out of extreme professional curiosity as an adaptation critic. The way he recreated so much of the early novels shot for shot wouldn't have been sustainable if they wanted to have a realistically length film, so would he have taken an even amount from all 6, or would he have almost completely abandoned entire books so he could concentrate on doing justice to the ones he kept? I want to know so bad. Ideally, speaking strictly from an adaptation perspective, I really think this should have been a trilogy with 2 books making up each film. That way they would have had time to include the insanely cool things they had to omit, like Knives' dad, and the really important things like Scott turning his life around and becoming the kind of person who does deserve the kind of happy ending he gets at the end. However, do I wish they'd actually done that? No, I guess not. Remember that Scott Pilgrim vs. the World bombed at the box office. If that had happened to the first of a 3-part trilogy, it would have been a one-way ticket to cancelled town, and we would have ended up with a frustratingly incomplete third of a story instead of an imperfect but at least finished product. As I've said, in this case I saw the film first and thought it was a fun action flick with a clever concept and amazing directing and writing, so I was kind of expecting the comics to be a similar sort of thing, fun and weird. I wasn't expecting them to be that, and surprisingly deep and relatable in several different ways, being enjoyable when taken at face value and when analysed to fuck, so that was a nice surprise. All in all, I make no apologies for taking the middle ground here and saying that both versions of this story, despite being different, are amazing and I love them. I've mentioned this a few times now, but there were several occasions where I didn't notice issues with the film until I read the comic and saw them done slightly better, and while that does suggest comic superiority, it also speaks to the film's credit, as it basically means you need a cheat sheet to critique it. I would definitely recommend the comics to a fan of the film, and I probably would recommend the film to a fan of the comics, though I might take a few minutes to set expectations beforehand. Thank you so much for joining me, my beautiful watchers. If I might leave you with the now standard reminder that liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing is the best way to stop your favourite channels from being consumed by the all-powerful and very broken YouTube algorithm. Huh. You're, still here? Do you want to fight again? Alright, come on, I'll tell Terrence we have another one. Hello again, my beautiful watchers. I just wanted to take this opportunity to give you a quick reminder that there's a wonderful website called Patreon that's been allowing online producers to actually make a living doing what they do, since apparently YouTube's decided that they shouldn't anymore. Basically, they offer the chance to pledge a certain amount of money per month or per video in exchange for various rewards offered by the creator. There's a variety of stuff you can earn by becoming one of my patrons, including early access to all videos and taking part in that survey you see at the start of every Lost in Adaptation episode. That's actually a very important part of the process, as I use it to gauge how much I'm going to need to explain about the book and the film before I start comparing them. If you decide to become a higher level contributor, your name will be added to the credits that you're seeing right now, and you'll be given the option to join my private chat room so you can regularly talk with me and other patrons. If you're keen enough to join the topmost tier of patronage, you'll earn the most coveted of all the rewards, the chance to pick a future adaptation to be reviewed by yours truly. However, if right now you are thinking, my goodness the Dom, I can't do that, I was going to. I found a magic lamp that granted me 3 wishes, and I meant to wish for infinite wealth, but, well, long story short, I have 3 jetpacks now. Fear not, it would still be a huge help to me if you were to give that like button the old clickaroo, share this episode on social media with perhaps a little recommendation to your friends to check it out, and subscribe if you've not already. It really helps my channel grow and reach new beautiful watchers. I hope you have a most pleasant day, and I will see you in the next episode.